Okay, today we're going to talk about shopping in supermarkets after Pesach, and it turns out that actually in around Pesach of 2013, I spoke about this topic first, and at that time I spoke about two parts of the question. One part of the question was about whether if the supermarket is owned by someone, by a partnership of a Jew and a non-Jew who are owned by a corporation, whether that would be a reason to say there aren't problems of chametz of Pesach. I'm going to explain that in a second, but whether there are or not problems. And the second thing was, what happens if they made Mechiras chametz? Could that possibly solve their problems? And say, does that mean that is Mechiras chametz effective? What are weaknesses about Mechiras chametz? What about what they buy and sell on Pesach? Is that including the Mechir? All kinds of questions like that. Those are the questions we spoke about at that time, which we're not going to speak about today. And at that time I said there are three questions that I'm not talking about, and that's what I am going to speak about today. Well, one of them is determining whether the store is in fact owned by someone Jewish. That actually I'm not going to talk about today either. Sorry. But the other two that I said I'm not talking about were what about if there's a distributor who's Jewish? Then we spoke only about what happens if the store owner, the owner of the supermarket is Jewish. We didn't speak about the distributor. And today we're going to also speak about the other thing I mentioned then, which was, let's say we determined there's a problem. Yes, it was owned by a Jewish person, the supermarket or the distributor, and we have a problem of chametz of haPesach. How do we know when we're finished? How do we know that the chametz is gone and there's no more left, or enough not left, or enough of a question that I therefore should be allowed to buy the chametz in that store? And that is what we're going to speak about today. Okay, so that's sort of just to clear the air of what the difference is between today and 12 years ago. So the beginning is, of course, that there's an issue called chametz of haPesach, which is that if a Jewish person owns chametz on Pesach, then that chametz is also, no one's allowed to eat it, and no one's allowed to have hana from it forever. And Chazal created that issur. They created that issur as a way to discourage people. Sorry about the noise here. To discourage people from owning chametz on Pesach, because if you own it, you're ever by Rasi, which is a deraisa. So Chazal Aser said if you do it, the food will be Aser forever, Aser to eat and Aser to have enough from. And of course, people who are careful about shmiras hamitzvahs, they get rid of the chametz before Pesach, or they sell it to someone before Pesach. And of course, they don't do anything with chametz on Pesach. They're careful about this. But the question is, our question that we're facing is, what happens if we have a supermarket or a distributor who's owned by someone who's Jewish, he's a Jewish person, and he did or didn't do Mechiras chametz. We'll talk about whether he did or didn't. He did or didn't do Mechiras chametz, but he keeps running his business as usual. He keeps buying chametz and selling chametz as if it's a regular thing. What happens to that chametz for that also? And we're not going to focus on does that invalidate his mechira? That we're not talking about. That was spoke about last time. But we're going to talk about is, how does that affect my determining now, can I eat this chametz after Pesach? Okay, so the big question that we're going to talk about, the halacha question we're going to talk about to begin with, before we get to the, so to speak, practical side, is that chametz of alav Pesach is an issur d'rabbanan. As we know, it's an issur d'rabbanan. So the simple understanding we should say is that chametz of alav Pesach is a d'rabbanan. The rule is Safek d'rabbanan l'kula. So we should say is, if I walk into the store and I don't know, and I look in the store and I see chametz that they have in the store, it could be that this store that was owned by a Jewish person, or that had a distributor that was Jewish, it could be that they owned this on Pesach. It could be they didn't. I have no way of knowing whether this box of spaghetti or this package of cookies was owned by the Yid on Pesach or not. So I should say Safek d'rabbanan l'kula. I don't know if it's Aser or not. I mean, I don't know if he owned it on Pesach or he didn't own it on Pesach. Since I don't know, so I should say Safek d'rabbanan l'kula, and I should be allowed to eat it. And in fact, we will see that many of the Achronim, in fact, say that it's like any other issur d'rabbanan. There's nothing different about it, and therefore we say Safek d'rabbanan l'kula, and you're allowed to eat it. And that should be the end of the discussion. But on the other hand, there is a dissenting opinion. So that's what we're going to focus a little on that. And that is like this. The Gemara says in Pesachim that if you find chametz in the store after Pesach, it sounds very similar to our story, and you're not sure if it belonged to a Yid or a Guy, okay? The exact scenario is complicated and not relevant to us for right now. But it's a question. You don't know if it belonged to a Yid over Pesach, which would make it Aser, or for belonging to a guy, which would make it mutter. So the Magen Avraham says, and there are all kinds of opinions what the din is in that case. So again, that's not our focus here. The Magen Avraham says that if you look at Rashi and Tosfos in a different Gemara, that's actually a Gemara in Eruvin, you see that they say what they're saying supports what the Bach says beferish, or it seems to say beferish in Hilchos Chametz, in Hilchos Pesach. In Hilchos Pesach, that if there's a Safek, if food is chametz of love Pesach or not, you're not sure whether it was. That's like our case or the case here with this in the store. When you're not sure, then the din is like this: you're not allowed to eat the food. That food is because chametz of Pesach is asur, but you're allowed to have hanor from that food. Okay, usually chametz of Pesach is asur b'achila and b'hana. He says in this case where it's a Safek, it's asur b'achila, but it's a mutter b'hana. So the later poskim have many questions on this shita of the Bach, which is really, so to speak, they more focus on the fact that the Magen Avraham brings this shita. So some of them, Chakyav, Mukar Chaim, and Yontif, they say the raya that the Magen Avraham brings from Rashi and Tosfos is not correct. There's all kinds. They have other ways of reading the Rashi and Tosfos. That's not what we're going to talk about. All the details. But they have the raya the Magen Avraham brings is not right. They're not disagreeing that the Magen Avraham says it. They just say that's not. There's no raya from Rashi and Tosfos. Others, the Pri Megadim and Reb Kveker, they say this whole idea that we could have this, so to speak, compromise makes no sense. How could something be if it's chametz of Pesach? Then you can't eat it and you can't have a nut. If it's not chametz or Pesach, then you can eat it and you can't have a nut. So what kind of thing is this? That thing could be in the middle. It could be asur b'achila but mutter b'hana. They say there's no such thing. There's no that's such a, they can't wrap their heads around such a thing. The same if either is or is not chametz of Pesach, and the din should be either completely l'chumra or completely l'kula. Okay, but many Chakyav on the Yontif, they say, what happened to Safek Rabban L'Kula? That's the most obvious and seemingly the strongest question, which is, this is a shayla of Rabbanan. We don't know if it belonged to a Yid or a Goy over Pesach, which is like our case. Again, that case of the Gemara there, which is about a store, it's not a store like we're thinking, but it's the same kind of idea, but basically the same question. We have a store, we don't know if it's owned by Yid or a Goy, so why don't we say Safek Rabban L'Kula? What's the problem? Why shouldn't we say that? That's like seemed like the strongest question. So, there are some Acharonim try to give answers to explain this shita as Magen Avraham / Bach. We're going to focus on a specific one. I'll just mention quickly what some of the other people say is not to answer all the questions, but at least to answer the last question, which is why not say Safek Rabban L'Kula. So Ani Yontif says, I'm going to do these quickly to get to the one that we're really going to focus on. Ani Yontif says it's a chazaka. He says. Chazaka means is when we have a status of something, we assume we kept that status forever, and until we know that something changed about it. So on Pesach, he says it was usher to eat and have hana from this chametz. That's obvious because it was even if it belonged to a guy, it was usher to eat then. And now we don't know whether that status changed. It could be that when Pesach ended, it became mutter because it wasn't Pesach anymore, or it stayed usher because it was chametz of Pesach. So we don't know whether it stayed usher or not. So we should say Chazaka should say is, he says we should say Chazaka should tell us that it stayed usher. Okay, that would be, he says, a possible reason to explain the Magen Avraham, but he says that he doesn't accept that. He says that's a pshat. He doesn't like it because he says is Chazak only tells us that the status that you had originally continued on and on and on until we know it stopped. He says here we know the original status stopped. That's not a question that the original Chazaka that there was of it being chametz, the status that it had of being chametz that's also to eat on Pesach, of course that stopped because Pesach is over. So it's just a question whether a new status came. So why should we think that the old one transfers to the new one? Okay, in fact, that might be totally in the shaila. The machlokes about machzikin the isla iser, which is in Siman Kuf Yud, talks about that. So that's one possibility. I'm not mentioning. I won't say it, but the Beis Meir has another possibility of maybe certain hanas are mutter and not other ones. He doesn't like it, but it's mentioned such an idea. So let's get to what we want to really focus on: the pshat and the Magen Avraham. Why would it be that the Magen Avraham? What happened to Safek Rabban L'Kula? So he says like this. We're going to focus on the answer of the Chemed Moshe, who says like this. He says the Gemara says there's a Gemara on Taf Yud in Pesach. It says like this. If someone forgot to do b'dikas chametz on the right night, the night you're supposed to do b'dikas chametz, the Gemara says you should do b'dika anyhow, even la'achar hamoyed. Okay, you should even do it la'achar hamoyed. Okay, so Rashi says la'achar hamoyed means is that it's on Erev Pesach after Chatzos when it's already usher to eat chametz, and you do so. It's achar moed means already after the moed already started, and you're not allowed the chametz also to eat and to own, and you do bedika to avoid the isser of owning chametz at that point. Okay, that's what Rashi learns. Tosfos says no. Tosfos says is lachar moed means you remembered after Pesach, after the whole moed is over, not after the moed began. After the whole moed is over, so it's after Pesach. And so, what are you doing b'tikas chametz for? There's no isser to own chametz then. He says you do chametz then because maybe because you want to make sure you want to find the chametz that was there. Because if not, what you didn't find by mistake will later get mixed into your regular food, and it'll be over. You'll be over in the isser of eating chametz of Pesach. So you're doing bedikas chametz to avoid chametz of Pesach. Okay, so now the Chaim Moshe says okay, that's the machlokes Rashi and Tosfos. He says when I went to do bedikas chametz after Pesach, he says, do I know that I have chametz? No, I have no idea if I have chametz. It's a Safek. I don't know if I have it or not. And even so, according to Tosfos, I'm mechoyev to go check afterwards. Why am I checking for? Obviously, it's a Safek. Why don't I say Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula? I don't have to be choishish that there's going to be chametz of Pesach. It tells us that when Chazal were particularly machmir about the issue of chametz of Pesach, and they were also chizikly devrehim to say that even though it's a Safek, even so Safek chametz of Pesach is so chamer that they said also chizikly devrehim, and they said you're not allowed to. You have to be machmir even for cases of Safek. So that's the Chaim Moshe says. That's his understanding pshat and Tosfos about why you have to be even if the chametz, even if the Pesach. And he says, and since the din is, if you look at Shulchan Aruch, you'll see we passing like Tosfos that you have to do bedika even if it's after Pesach. You still have to do the bedika anyhow. So that's pshat. That's why we can't. That's why we have to be machmir about Safek. That's why the Magen Avraham and the Bach say we have to be machmir about Safek chametz of Pesach. This Isser is more chamer than a regular Idrabanan, and in the sense they treat it like a Deraisa, and therefore we have to be choshesh even for Safek chametz of Lav Pesach. Okay, now I'll mention. So that's the Pshat in the Chaim Moshe. To me, that was the most clear and strongest pshat in the Magen Avraham the Bach. Again, they're not explaining why it could be Asur B'Chila but not Asur B'Hana. That they're not explaining. Just explaining why we don't say Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. Now, you should know the Oineg Yontif argues on this pshat. He brings such an idea, the same kind of idea as the Chaim Moshe says, but he says there's no riot from Tosfos because he says if a person didn't do bedikas chametz before Pesach, he says it's not Safek chametz of Pesach. It's for sure that the person has chametz because we just assume that if you didn't get rid of your chametz before Pesach, then you obviously people eat chametz all year round. Of course, you have chametz, so it's not a Safek even at all. It's more vada that you have to get rid of it. Okay. Now you could also another reason to potentially argue on the Chaim Moshe is that to say that this, according to Tosfos, it's not a chumrah of bedikas. It's not a chumrah of chametz of Pesach. It's a chumrah of bedikas chametz. Bedikas chametz by its very nature is an isser that applies. It's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan that applies even in cases of Safek. That's the whole point of bedikas chametz. Look for chametz. Maybe you have chametz. That's the whole point of the whole isser. So maybe it's just a chumrah of bedikas chametz that it applies even after Pesach also. Okay, but the Beis Yosef does not say that. If you look in the Beis Yosef, he says is. So he talks about it from the angle of the chametz other side of it. Okay, and one more last thing is that the Chaim Moshe is saying is Chazal were asked over here, even though it's a Safek. Now, there's a Gemara in Ksubas that says is that that we have a rule that sometimes Chum also chizikly devreim kishal Torah. The Gemara says vade the devreim of the Rabbanan chizik, Safek the devreim of the Rabbanan chizik. Usually, when we say also Rabbanan chizik kishal Torah, is not in cases of Safek. Anyhow, so that's not like this. Anyhow, so back to where we were. Our best answer we have here is the Chaim Moshe. Well, to me, the most clear answer is that the Chaim Moshe is saying the reason why to be machmer about Safek chametz of Pesach would be because. Here the Chacham were we can see in the Gemara the Chacham according to Tosfos were particularly machmir about this Isser. Now, so that's what we've talked about what the Magen Avraham says, but you should know as I mentioned, many of the Acharonim disagree with this Magen Avraham, and they say Safek chametz of Pesach is completely mutter. The Mishnah Berurah brings both shitas. First, he says the Magen Avraham says what the Magen Avraham says that you can't eat it, the Safek chametz of Pesach, but you can't have enough from it. And then he says others say that it's completely mutter. And then at the end of the Mishnah, he says you could be makel in cases if you're strong indication that this Safek chametz really was from a guy, meaning that it wasn't chametz of a Pesach. So that's when you could be makel when you have a strong reason to believe that it wasn't chametz of a Pesach, and which gives the vibe that he really thinks the Magen Avraham, he's accepting what the Magen Avraham says, because if you don't hold the Magen Avraham, it's always mutter Safek. So the fact that he's telling you it's only mutter in case when you have a strong reason to believe it tells us seems like he's going like the Magen Avraham. Okay. There's these words that the Mishnah is saying. Maybe I won't get into this detail, but these words that when you're very a strong indication is not exactly what the Magen Avraham said. The Magen Avraham says you could be in certain cases you could be toila, but there's reason the Mishnah there's thought here behind why the Mishnah thinks that toila means is not like toilim b'drabanan usually, which is very kal. You could be easily toila. You have to only could be toila if there's a strong reason to be toila. Okay, we won't talk about that, but there's reason to think like that. So that's the Mishnah gives that implication, but in the Chuvas in Rav Moshe when he speaks about it, he doesn't even mention Magen Avraham. He just says of course, chametz of Pesach follows the rules of Safek Drabanan L'Kul. It's obvious, like Tim, that's obvious. I'll mention. I'm sorry if I just went around this by mistake. The Chassam Sofer says that there's a nafkamina between a case where we're not sure if this thing was owned by a Yid or not. That's the cases we're talking about. That's contrasted to a case where we know the Yid owned it on Pesach, but we don't know if the thing is chametz or not. We have a food, we're not sure if it's chametz, but we know that the Yid owned it. So there, the Chassam Sofer says is that Yid was not allowed to own it on Pesach. When he stood there on Erev Pesach, say, should I keep this or should I get rid of it? He was mechuyev to get rid of it. Then it was a Safek D'Oraisa for him. The fact that he did the wrong thing and kept it, that is exactly what Chazal Asr is something you weren't allowed to keep like this, and you kept it. That's what's Asr. So that would be Asr. But our case, so even though there's a Safek involved in it, but the Safek was l'chumra as far as keeping the Pesach. So our question is not like that. Our question is, we have a food we know it's chametz, it's a loaf of bread, we just don't know if the Yid owned it or not. So that's our case of Safek. And again, so back to Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe says is, of course, Safek Drabanan L'Kul. So why not? Of course you could be mekel. He says, but Rav Moshe says, you should know, you could only be mekel if there's basically a 50-50 chance that it's mutter. I mean, you can't just say any Safek. If I walk into the store on the day of the Pesach, and this chametz, the Yid owned the chametz over the whole Pesach. I buy a box of noodles. Maybe they got it today. Maybe it just showed up today, and he didn't own it for Pesach. That's not a Safek. It's obvious. It's almost for sure that this was here for Pesach. So Ramesh says not any little Safek, but if it's a reasonable Safek, meaning we'll say 50-50, then it's going to be mutter. Okay. Moshe says you have to have some kind of an understanding of what buying and selling goes to understand whether that should be mutter. And that's we're going to go with that sheet. We're going to go with what Moshe says, which is I can't say it's so terribly different than what the Mishnah Berurah says within the Magen Avraham. And the Mishnah Berurah says you have to have a strong indication that it's mutter. That's maybe a little more than 50%, but we'll stay with what Moshe says, and which again many of the Achronim who don't agree with Magen Avraham, that's to say that if it's Safek, then it's mutter. Safek is mutter, assuming we have a reasonable Safek, not just any kind of Safek. Okay, so now let's see how that applies in Halacha L'Maisa. How does that apply to walking into our supermarket that either the supermarket was owned by Yid or the distributor was owned by Yid? Now, let me just give some like sort of caveats or some assumptions before we move on to there. The first is we're assuming it's been determined that this store or this distributor is owned by a Jewish person. So what I mean by that is like this. We didn't talk about this today, but like we don't say is, well, maybe the guy's Jewish, his name is Bernstein, maybe that means he's Jewish. No, just because he has a Jewish name, that doesn't mean he's Jewish. Or another thing, what happens if what I spoke about in 2013, which is, what happens if it's a partnership? And we spoke about then that some hold that if as long as the Yid owns less than 50% of the company, of the partnership, then the food is not usher as chametz of Pesach. Well, if you hold like that, if you accept that shita, then this is not a Jewish owned store. for our purposes, this is not Jewish. No, if you say no, even less than 50% is Jewish, then this is a Jewish store. So again, we're assuming this is a Jewish store, whatever you qualify yourself as a Jewish store. Then also we're assuming when I talk about that there was a Mechiras chametz, I mean it was a Mechiras chametz that you considered to be valid. And I mean by that is that I spoke about that time also is that what happens if I make Mechiras chametz and I keep the Jewish person made Mechiras chametz, but he kept buying and selling chametz on Pesach. Some people think that completely invalidates the Mechira. So they would say there was no Mechiras chametz. So, but we're working with the assumption that there was a Mechiras chametz, which again, like Moshe we spoke about that time, says that no, it doesn't invalidate the Mechira. So we're working with when we say there. I'm going to tell you cases that there was a Mechiras chametz. I mean is a Mechiras chametz that you consider to be a valid Mechiras chametz. If you say no, this is not a valid Mechiras chametz because he kept being in business, then you're switched to the other cases where I'll tell you what happens if there was no Mechiras chametz. Okay, that's an assumption. And I'm also working with the assumption within Mechiras chametz that the Mechira only at most can work for things that they owned for the whole Pesach. But things that they bought on Pesach or they sold on Pesach, those things are not covered. Again, we spoke about this last time. At that time, those things are not covered by the Mechira. There are those who disagree, but we're working with that assumption that those things are not covered in the Mechira also. So again, if you think they're covered, then you have to recalculate some of these things, but we're assuming that those things are not covered in the Mechira. Okay, so now let's see how we can figure out how do I know? I walk into the store. It's a few days after Pesach. How do I know if this bag of pretzels is usher or is not usher? So, in order to get to the answer to this, we turn to the following. In the grocery industry, they have a term called inventory turnover rate. Okay, and that's something that they use as a way of determining how often per year the store sells out all the inventory. Now, of course, it's an average, but they do is what they do is they want to know is if a store turns over all the inventory more often, then the store is considered to be more successful because they're selling more. Now, so the way you do it is you calculate as follows: you take the cost of the goods sold. That means every bag of pretzels and cookies and apples and everything like that. How much did it cost them to buy that? For the whole year, how much the whole year they bought this much worth of stuff, and you divide that by their average inventory that they have during the year. Okay, the average inventory is done by averaging the starting inventory versus the ending inventory. So all these numbers obviously are not perfect because that's not necessarily the average, but it's as close as we're going to get to it. And it's just used as a way of measuring. It's just a broad way of measuring how a store is doing. And then we divide, so again, cost of goods sold divided by average inventory gives us this number. So I'm going to give you an example. Kroger, during the year 2023, their cost of goods sold was I'm rounding numbers, about $117 billion for all their stores. And the average inventory, meaning beginning of the year and end of the year, the average inventory was about $9.6 billion. Okay, and that means is we calculate cost of goods sold divided by average inventory, and it comes out, if you use the numbers that are more correct, not so rounded like me, it comes out the inventory turnover rate was 12.17. Okay, that means is a little more than 12 times a year, each thing gets sold. So if you see on the shelves, they have every day on the shelf there's 10 bottles of ketchup. That means is over the year they would sell 12.17 times a year. They resell those full 10 bottles. Of course, it's not perfect because it's only an average. So they might sell way more. They may resell their fresh baked goods 20 times a year, and their seasonal items might sell 2 times a year. But it's just a overall number to use, and that's what we're gonna use. Now, companies don't tell everybody this is our cost, this is our inventory turnover rate. They're not advertising that number. It's an internal number that they use for themselves. But we can calculate it ourselves for publicly traded companies because they're required to file a form called a 10K. That's the name of the form, 10K, for publicly traded companies. And in there are cost of goods sold and inventory for the beginning of the year and the end of the year. So we can calculate ourselves, which I did. So I looked at 3 chains of stores. One is called Inglis Market. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Has about 200 stores. Their inventory turnover rate was 9.6. Weiss Market, which has about 200 stores, their inventory turnover rate was 11.8. And Kroger, that I just mentioned to you, which has 2,700 stores, is about 12.2. Okay, so that means is in English market, which has the 9.6, that means every 38 days, on average, everything in the store is sold and replaced with fresh products. Okay, in Weiss market that would be every 31 days. In Kroger it would be every 30 days. Okay, we have a possible number for an Albertsons. That's a privately held company, so I'm not sure how they got that number. I'm not going to mention it. Okay, now the food distributors have a higher inventory turnover rate. Again, I went out that Cisco and U.S. Foods. For Cisco, it was 14, and U.S. Foods, it was 18.3. Okay, so they restock their products every 26 or 20 days, according to these two ways of looking at it. So for our purposes, I'm going to be picking 23 days as the turnover rate, as how often it turns over for a distributor, and 30 days for a supermarket. Okay, now. We don't really have time for this. I'll go through this quickly, and that is that for spirits, the rules are a little different. They don't use this term inventory turnover rate. They use a similar term called days on hand. How much product do they keep on hand of each of their products? Do they keep on hand in their distribution center? It was hard. I couldn't get real numbers for this because I couldn't find spirit distributors, like people who distribute beer or whiskey, that are publicly traded and are revealing this information and are not selling other things that would sort of confuse our numbers. So we asked. So the first thing to know is like this: we asked some people who work with some Kashrus people to speak to their distributors who they had connection to, and they said like this: a couple of things. First of all, they said is, as a rule, distributors want to buy as much. They want large quantities of a product at a time because they get the best deals then. And that means I know this is going to sound backwards, the items that are less popular, they will have more days on hand of those items because they have to buy more at a time in order to get the good deals. And I'll give you an example. These are made up numbers. Let's say a trailer could hold 1,000 cases of whiskey, and he sells 100 cases a week of that brand of whiskey. So he would want to buy a full trailer to get the best deal, but even though that means now he has 70 days worth, 10 weeks worth of product on hand. But it was kedai to buy the whole trailer in order to get the better deal, even though it means he's going to have 10 weeks worth of product on hand. Now, what happens if if a trailer holds 2,000 cases of beer, of a popular brand of beer, of which he sells 500 cases of that a week? That means he can take a trailer, he'll buy a trailer, but that trailer will only last him for 4 weeks, for 28 days, before he sells out. So the beer, which is more popular, ends up having less days on hand because that's what it took to get the better deal by the whole trailer. Okay, now, so it turns out that whiskey sells more slowly than beer, and certain brands of each beer and whiskey are more popular than other ones. And I couldn't get exact numbers, but it looked like 30 days on hand was pretty typical for distributors. That's what it seemed like, and much less for very popular brands. And whiskey, it would be more like 60 days on hand. About 60 days on hand, which would be about a 24 inventory turnover. Okay, so let me go through now I have 10 scenarios to go through, see if I can get through them. And in order to make our decision about how long I have to wait if at all, before I buy chametz, I have to keep a bunch of things in mind. The first one I told you is we're going to look for when is it a 50-50 chance? When do we have that the store has more than 50% of their chametz is mutter. Once we hit that point, then we say Rav Moshe said Safek and we're going to be allowed to buy there. If it's less than 50%, we're not going to do it. Okay, whether Rav Moshe meant exactly 50%, I don't know, but that's what we're going to work with. So we have to know is the supermarket owned by a Jewish person? Is the distributor owned by a Jewish person? And do they do a Mechiras chametz? Again, as I told you, is it owned by a Jewish person? Depends on your shita. Is this person? Is there enough Jewish ownership here to be considered Jewish? And did they do Mechiras chametz? That means do you like the Mechira? You don't like the Mechira. One last twist on assume you like Mechiras is what happens if someone did Mechiras chametz for the whole company? We spoke about that last time also. Is that valid or is that not valid? That's not so relevant to us. That question, what I mean is like this. If you think that a Mechira of the whole company is considered a valid sale, that can be considered, yes, it was fully sold out, no problem, it's considered sold, then this is not a Jewish-owned company, because the whole company was sold to someone that's not Jewish. If you think that Mechira is not valid, again, as we spoke about the other time, then you don't think it's a valid Mechira, then it's owned by a Jewish person. So this has nothing to do with Mechiras. Mechira, we're talking about either Mechiras chametz, a traditional way, which is I say I'm selling the guy my chametz, but I'm keeping the store. Okay, so I have 10 cases, and the 10 cases are going to switch off of which person was Jewish. Did they do Mechiras chametz? And that's what we're going to be 10 cases. Let me go through them. Instead, I'm not going to list them all for you now. I'm just going to go through them one at a time. Okay, let's first deal with a Jewish-owned supermarket. We have 2 cases where a Jewish person owned the supermarket. He owned the supermarket, and he did not do Mechiras chametz. It's the simplest case. A Jewish person owns a supermarket. He didn't do Mechiras chametz. What happened when the end of Pesach comes? We're working with an assumption that supermarkets have 30 days of stock of their stuff on the shelves. Again, working based on inventory turnover rate. So he has 30 days at the end of Pesach. At the end of Pesach, he's got 30 days worth of stuff of chametz of Pesach on his shelves. Now, on average, every day they sell 1 day's worth of produce. If you have 30 days of stuff, that means every day I sell 1 day's worth of stuff, and I get deliveries of 1 day's worth of stuff. So if whatever comes in the deliveries, that's permitted chametz, because that's coming from my distributor who's not Jewish. We're not dealing with a Jewish distributor now, just a Jewish supermarket. So what comes in every day is mutter. What goes out every day is not relevant. That's gone. So every day I lose 1 day's worth of chametz of Pesach, and I gain 1 day of permitted chametz. So on a day after that, so once it's a day later, 1 day after Pesach, it's now a ratio of 1 heter to 29 isser. So I'm still not at 50%. So as you can imagine, after 15, 16 days, at that point I will be holding where it'll be at least half my stuff will be mutter and half will be asur, give or take, and therefore I'll have a legitimate Safek, and that's what I could buy this. So I'm waiting a little more than 2 weeks to buy in this store that's owned by a Jewish person, did not do Mechiras chametz, his distributor is not Jewish. I could buy after 2 weeks. Now, if the Jewish supermarket had done Mechiras chametz, that means let's think what their status is. They did Mechiras chametz. On the days before Pesach, they had 30 days worth of stock of stuff. Over the next 9 days of Pesach, they sold each day, Erev Pesach and the 8 days of Pesach. Each day they sold chametz. That's gone. What they got deliveries of was asur, because as we said, we're working with the assumption that deliveries that come in on Pesach, that the Yid buys on Pesach, are not included in the Mechira. So come the end of Pesach, he has his stock of noodles or cookies and things like that are 21 days worth of heter, because that was included in the Mechira. It didn't. He had sold it for Pesach, and he has 9 days of deliveries that he got over Pesach. So that means right now he's already holding by a ratio of more heter than isser, and therefore already on that day you're allowed to shop there, because it's Safek on the cool. I say Safek. I can work with an assumption that what I'm getting is not going to be chametz of Pesach, and it only gets better each day. It just keeps getting better, and every day he keeps getting new deliveries. He's selling off some of his stuff and getting more heter coming into the store. So it gets only better. So you can shop there right after Pesach and keep on going as long as you want to. Okay. What about if the distributor was also Jewish? We're going to get that soon. Now let's switch to some more cases where the distributor was Jewish and the store owner was not Jewish. Okay, we'll do first those where the distributor was Jewish but the store owner was not. Okay, so before we get to the actually can I buy in the supermarket, we have to think about the status of the food at the distributor himself, because that's going to play into us. So our first case is we have a distributor. The distributor, we're working with an assumption that he sells his stuff after 23 days. If he didn't do Mechiras chametz, that means on the day after Pesach, everything that the distributor, all 23 days worth of stuff is chametz. It's chametz of a Pesach. It takes him about 12 days till he will get rid of all that chametz and replace it with fresh, with stuff that's not Isser. He got it from the manufacturers who are not Jewish. So after 12 days, he'll be at the point where it's 50-50, and what leaves his distribution center will be mutter. We're not talking about what you can buy in the supermarket. We're just talking about what leaves his place after 12 days will be. What happens if he did Mechiras chametz? Then let's think what happened. Before Pesach started, his stuff was all mutter. After Pesach, he's gone through 9 days of Pesach, so he has 9 days of deliveries that he received, which are asur. those delivers also because they're not included in the Mechira, but all the other days of stuff that he has, the other, I don't know how many days, 23 minus 9 worth of days that he has worth of stuff, that stuff is included, was sold, did not belong to him on Pesach, and was not touched on Pesach. So that product is going to still be mutter. That product, is going to be mutter. And therefore, that what's leaving the distribution from the distributor, even the day after Pesach, is going to be mutter. And again, it's going to keep getting better because as they keep on selling more stuff, as it gets more deliveries, it's going to be mutter. Okay, so now let's move to the supermarket. And now we're talking about a case where the supermarket is owned by someone who's not Jewish, but the distributor was Jewish. Okay, the opposite of the original cases we had. The distributor was not Jewish. So let's say the distributor did not do Mechiras chametz. So the chametz that he gives to I said before was if he didn't do Mechiras chametz, then for 12 days after Pesach, what he ships to his stores is going to be aser. So what he sends to the supermarkets for those first 12 days is going to be aser. However, that's not everything that's at the supermarket, because remember, the supermarket is not owned by a Jewish person. So he had lots of chametz in his store. The day after Pesach, he's got 30 days worth of stuff. Now, he's been getting some stuff over Pesach, and the stuff that he got over Pesach was 9 days worth of stuff over Pesach, and then 21 days of stuff that's mutter. And what's going to happen now? Every day, they sell some of that mutter chametz, and they get new aser chametz coming from the distributor, because for the 12 days afterwards, what they get is going to be aser. So on the last day of Pesach, the ratio of heter to iser is 21 to 9. They're good. For the next 6 days, there's going to be more heter than iser. For 6 days after that, again, for the next 6 days, that's the last 6 days of the 12, they're going to be still getting iser from the distributor, and that's getting rid of heter that they had originally. So you're not going to be allowed to buy there for those 6 days, because during those 6 days, there's going to be less than 50% heter. Once we pass those days after after that, then after that they won't be getting any more issa coming into their store. But still, for another 5 more days, they're going to still have more issa than heter. So then, starting on day 18, will you now be back to the point where there's more heter than issa, and you'll be or 50-50, and you'll be allowed to buy there. So to summarize, for this unusual case, the distributor was Jewish, did not do Mechiras chametz, but he's selling to a supermarket. For 6 days after Pesach, you could buy there. Then you can't buy there for 11 days, and so now then after that, starting day 18, you could buy there again. Now, what I just said sounded really exact and very calculated for 6 days like this, and then 11 days like this. That sounds very calculated, but just bear in mind that it's all based on assumptions. And if we change some of those assumptions, numbers will move around also. Like, for example, what happens if the distributor's turnover rate is 20 days instead of 23 days? Then 6 days will stay mutter, but then there'll only be 7 days that are aser afterwards, not 11 days. And when we change a different variable, what happens if a supermarket keeps 35 days of stock instead of 30 days? So that would mean now that things would change around there also. Then for 8 days after Pesach, you could shop there, and no shopping for 7 days. But the 6-11 was a most reasonable hedge we come up to, but again, it's not exact, and it might be a few days this way or that day, and maybe some would consider that even enough of a Safek also. Okay, but what my point here is that there's a floating amount. There's going to be first days that are days that you can buy, then days that you can't buy, and then back to days that you can buy. Now, what happens if the distributor did Mechiras chametz, and again, the supermarket is still owned by someone who's not Jewish? Then you could shop there anytime you want after Pesach. That's because the only chametz which is going to be usher at the supermarket are stuff that was delivered on Pesach. Anything that was delivered before Pesach, of course, is mutter, and even stuff delivered after Pesach is mutter. Because you remember, I told you that from anything, if the distributor did Mechiras chametz, whatever he sells after Pesach is assumed to be mutter stuff because it's mostly heter. So the supermarket at the end of Pesach has only 9 days worth of chametz, shavuot Pesach, because that's what he got on Pesach. He has more heter of that, and he keeps getting the rest. But all the deliveries he gets afterwards are also heter. So it's mutter. It's more than 50% after Pesach. The numbers only get better. So again, it's mutter for good. So we were holding right now is that if the supermarket or the distributor is Jewish and whoever was Jewish did Mechiras. So if only one of them was Jewish, and that Jewish person did Mechiras chametz, then you could buy in the store immediately after Pesach, and then forever as long as you wanted to. If they didn't do Mechiras chametz, then things were a little more complicated. Okay, now let's move to a bunch of cases where both of them are Jewish owned. Okay, that gets a little more complicated. That's going to be another 4 cases. Okay, now, if neither of them did Mechiras chametz, not the distributor and not the supermarket, and they were both Jewish owned, so all the chametz in the store and at the distributor are usher when Pesach ends. Okay, and the supermarket is going to keep getting isser for 12 days. Remember, the distributor for 12 days, whatever he sells is going to be usher. So it takes 12 days before the store starts even getting any heter. Then it takes another 15 days of heter deliveries, so to speak, before the amount of heter chametz in the supermarket will be more than the amount of isser chametz of Pesach in the store. So you won't be able to buy chametz in that store until the day after Lag B'Omer, 27 days after Pesach, 12 days before they even start getting any heter, and then another 15 days until there's more heter has arrived than there is isser. So not till the day after Lag B'Omer. Again, this is the case where the worst case, where both the distributor and the store owner were both Jewish and both did not do Mechiras chametz. Then you wouldn't be able to buy them until the day after Lag B'Omer. Okay. Now, what happens if the supermarket didn't Mechiras chametz and the distributor did not? Then what happens like this? Again, the supermarket did Mechiras chametz, so every chametz that they had for the whole Pesach is heter. Deliveries they got on Pesach and deliveries for the 12 days after Pesach is usher. So if you go through the numbers, I'm not going to go through it right now, the whole cheshbon, but if you go through the numbers, it turns out for 6 days after Pesach you could buy there. For the next 11 days you can't buy there, and after that, starting about a week before Pesach, like then you could start buying there again. What happens if the distributor did Mechiras chametz? The opposite. The distributor did Mechiras chametz, but not the supermarket. So, what the store... So again, they were both Jewish owned. So at the end of Pesach, everything at the store is usher, because they didn't do Mechiras chametz. They have 30 days worth of isser coming to them. What happens is, what the distributor is going to ship to them is going to be mutter, because he did Mechiras chametz, and again, we figured out that if the distributor did Mechiras chametz, what he ships after Pesach is going to be assumed to be heter. It'll be more than 50% assumed to be heter. So after 15 days at the supermarket, what he has, there'll be more heter than isser, and you'll be allowed to buy there after 15 days. What's the most kala case when both the distributor and the supermarket are Jewish owned? Is that both of them did do Mechiras chametz? So most of the stores, what they have after Pesach is mutter, as we've talked about in the past. Most of the and the deliveries they get after Pesach are also heter. So there's a certain amount of isser, but it's going to be more than 50% heter in both in the supermarket right after Pesach, and it'll continue to stay more than 50% heter, get better and better, and therefore it'll be mutter to buy there forever, as much as you want to. So it came out that if the person who's Jewish did Mechiras chametz, again, either if it was the supermarket who was Jewish or the distributor was Jewish, if that person did Mechiras chametz, or if both of them were Jewish and both did Mechiras chametz, again, in case where the Mechiras chametz was done, then you can buy it from the day of the Pesach and you can keep it buying forever. Again, even though they did the wrong thing, even though there's a certain amount of chametz, because they keep buying and selling chametz, and even though there's a certain amount of chametz there, we'll say that there's for sure more than 50% is there, and Safek Darbanon L'Kula, and you'll be allowed to buy it. What happens if the Jewish person, either the supermarket or the distributor or both, did not do Mechiras chametz? Then life is more complicated, and then there will be days you can't buy it. Sometimes you could buy it for a few days and then not buy it for a few days. Sometimes you can't buy it for a couple of days afterwards. Each case, as we spoke about, you have to wait a certain amount of days, and sometimes you have to wait even as long as till the day after Lag B'Omer. The case where they were both Jewish, supermarket and distributor, and neither did Mechiras chametz, but sometimes it was 2 weeks. Sometimes you had to wait a few days, and then yes, you could buy, then you couldn't buy. But all these things played into when you were allowed to buy after Pesach in the supermarket.